There we go. All right. So today is going to be that scope class. So all your questions hopefully will get answered, if not raise more, which is typically what will happen as you learn more. You're going to ask more questions, which is kind of a fantastic thing too. So today we want to talk about scope. Like, what is scope? And I'm going to give you just a little bit of like intro theory. And then I'm going to kick you into some breakout rooms to actually work through some exercises in the lesson. Then we'll kind of come back and we'll kind of recap from there. But let's start with a little bit of vocabulary first. Let me go over to my code editor here. Oops, I forgot to open something here. One sec. I'll just do it inside of here. All right, I'm going to share my screen over here. And we'll share some things about notes and so on. All right, so today is that scope class. So we're going to talk about different kinds of scope and why this matters. So let's start with a bit of a warm up. So for the next like 30 seconds or so, I want you to think about a couple of questions for me, and I'll drop them in the Zoom chat. And you don't have to have answers for all of these, but I'm going to drop them in the Zoom chat here. When you think of the idea of scope. So what do you think scope means when we talk about programming? What do you know about scope so far? What kinds of problems have you seen that you think might be scope related? And then this last one is the interesting one that I kind of want to touch on today, is like, what just everyday language words can you think of that have the word scope in there? And what do you think that means? So take like 30 seconds, 45 seconds or so, just to like glance at these questions, try to think of some ideas here, and then I'll call on a few people and see what you've got for answers. All right, we're going to start with Alex, and then I'm going to call on a couple other folks after that. So Alex, which of these questions do you want to try to answer, and what do you have for us?
In everyday life, maybe not every day for some people, but a scope can be used at a firing range. It shows you what your target is. It shows you what you can potentially hit as long as you're working within, you know, the distance and the capabilities of your firearm. I know it's like not what I wanted to bring up, but my other thought was mouthwash, and that's a little facetious.
Yeah, I always wondered, why did they call that mouthwash scope? That was always a little weird to me as a kid myself. Cool. All right, let's go to Taylor, and then I'm going to call on a couple of folks in the class. Taylor, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I guess in the context of programming, I just think of scope as literally context. So if a variable is inside a method, it's specific to that method. If it's outside of that, and so on. If it's inside of a class instance, it's specific to that. So I just kind of use scope and context interchangeably in my head, at least.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good definition to get us started. Cool. Let's call on a couple of folks. Let's go to Scott B. Scott, what do you think about some of these questions? What do you know about scope so far?
Yeah, I thought Taylor's explanation of that was great. I think context is a big part of that. But yeah, just making sure that you're, you know, calling stuff within, I guess, certain scope. I mean,
sure. Yeah. All right. Let's go to Karina. Karina, what do you think about this, or can you think of any other sort of plain language words that include the word scope and how that might be related to this?
No other words for like plain language. I was thinking for like the third question there, what problems that I feel like have arisen within the project so far is kind of the full understanding of when there's different classes, how the different variables within that can like interchange and where they lie in that scope.
Yep, great. And these are all really good explanations. When I think of the word scope, besides the mouthwash, which is always the first thing that comes to my mind, I think of things, and someone actually dropped in chat, what about periscope? Periscope's a good one. My mom was a nurse, so she had a stethoscope. I grew up as a Boy Scout, so I had a telescope. So all kinds of things with the word scope in there. And when you think about like what a periscope can do or what a telescope can do, we're looking at something in a very small sort of context, and that's all we see. And so whether you're a periscope looking in a, from a submarine, or you're a telescope and you're looking up in space, or, a stethoscope, which is not visual, but you're focusing, like you're hearing on one particular area wherever you're touching the stethoscope. And so, a couple of folks have brought up the idea of like the context of what we're doing. And this is actually a really good way of thinking about it. And so I stole a diagram from Megan. So thank you, Megan, for having this available. The idea of scope is really coming down to like what's available to us when. And so what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about kind of the vocabulary of kind of the context of these different pieces that we have. So when we talk about scope, some of the things that we're going to be sort of reading about and doing some exercises about, we're going to be talking certainly about variables. We're going to be talking about methods, and we're going to be talking about classes. And we're going to touch really briefly on something that we call global scope as well. But most of our attention is going to be focused on variables, methods, and classes today. And so when we come back and we kind of look at this, this diagram of Megan's, I'm actually going to show you a little bit of code here. Is this the one I want to show? It's not the one I want to show. It's the deck one I wanted to show. So let's go back to this diagram of Megan's. When we think about the idea of the scope of these things, so we have something called a block, and everything inside this block, everything that's inside the block right here has to do with, let's try this again, there we go. So everything that has to do with this block right here is basically this, where is it? This bit of code right here, find all. Now you're going to be learning about other sort of enumerables in a class later, but we talked a little bit about how we have this block of code that starts with a do and it has an end, or they might be those curly braces that we talked about when I was doing the .each class. And we have the idea of this card variable, which is our block variable, and that card variable only exists inside of that block. Outside of that block, we don't have access to that particular card variable anymore. And so when we think about scope, when we define a variable in here, it's only visible inside that block. Something outside of like this method out here can't see the variables that we define inside this block. Similarly, variables that we define in this method aren't necessarily available outside in our class, but we can always go inward. So things that are defined in our class will be available to our method. Things in our method will be available in our block. Sorry for the color here. It's a little bit light yellow on white. There we go. So things inside of our method will be available inside of our block. So if we define a variable out here, we can use that variable inside our block. If we define an instance variable in our class, we have access to that within our methods and also within our blocks. And so we can always go inward, but we can't go outward. So that's like a really high level overview of what we mean when we talk about scope, is when and where do we have access to these things. So when Ruby is going through and looking at its code, Ruby is always going to interpret things from top to bottom. And if we have a require statement here where we require in some other file, in this case, if I require in like my card class, for example, as Ruby is interpreting this file, it sees this first thing and it goes, okay, well, I need to pause here on this file. And now I need to go look, excuse me, I need to go look at this card and I'm going to interpret that line by line. And so Ruby is doing two things. As it's reading through these files, it's doing two things. It's either learning code or it's executing code. In this case, when we say, hey, I want to go require this file, excuse me, it's basically working top to bottom and goes, oh, okay, well, you're defining a class. and that's defining some attr readers, and that's defining a method called initialize, but there's no code to actually execute in here. And so Ruby is just remembering things. And so when we talk about the scope of things, Ruby interprets code top to bottom, and it's either learning code or it's executing code. So those are the only two modes that Ruby will have as it's looking through the code. It's either reading it, it's learning something, like a definition of a method, a definition of a class, or it's actually executing some code. And things like executing code would be like a runner file, where you're saying like, actually go run these Ruby instructions. All right, let's pause there and take some questions. So who's got questions about that so far? And we'll go into a little more definition. Let's go to Catherine.
So I wasn't real good at understanding the runner file last module,
Okay.
but so when you're doing like the runner file, are you trying to make sure that it's in order for how you want the code to execute? Because Ruby runs top to bottom.
Yeah, and so it has to learn all the definitions before it can actually execute the code. So for example, in my code, if I have like a class of dog, oops. But before I do that, I try to say like, dog.name. Well, it hasn't even learned about the dog class yet because it's running top to bottom. And so here it's saying, oh, you want me to go execute some code, but it doesn't even know what the dog variable is, because we haven't even done like, dog equals dog.new. We haven't even gotten to this execution line yet. And so because Ruby's running top to bottom, it looks at this line first and goes, okay, well, I'm currently looking at this line of code, but I don't know what this dog thing is. Like I haven't learned what dog is yet. Like I haven't seen that because that instruction's way down here. And because Ruby is running top to bottom, it runs into an error here that you've probably seen that would say, hey, I've got some, unknown local variable or method called dog. Like you're trying to do something with dog here and I have no idea what dog is.
So
Even if
it's
we did.
really,
Sorry, go ahead.
so it's really important how we're like structuring our class, like calling on our classes within the runner file so that it knows. I don't know what I'm asking.
No, it's okay. It's okay. So if I understand your kind of the question I think that you're trying to ask is it important what order we do these things in? And I would say yes. So in this case, even if I moved this line of code up top, even if I move this line up here, it would say, okay, well, now I know what the dog variable is, but I don't know what this dog class is. Like you're trying to do a dog.new, and I haven't learned what capital D dog is yet. So just for the sake of ambiguity here, I'm just going to change this to be like Riker. Oops, I want this one to be dog, and we want this to be Riker. So in this case, it's saying, okay, well, you want me to call dog.new, but I don't even know what dog is yet because the class of dog is way down here. And this is typically why at the very top of our Ruby files, this is where we would do those require statements, because the require is going to say, hey, go learn about that dog class and then come back and carry on from here. And so as Ruby's interpreting it, it actually pauses on this file and says, oh, you want me to go require that file? Let me go open that file, learn or execute any code in there. And then I'm going to come back and go, okay, well, that line is finished. Now I'm going to go on to line 2. Line 2 is blank. Now I'm going to come to here. Maybe it learned about this dog inside that require and says, okay, now I can do dog.new because I know what dog is. But if I don't do a require here and I define the class afterwards, this is where Ruby's like, I don't even know what dog.new is. Like you're trying to access something that I don't know anything about yet.
Okay.
And so there is a very specific order that we have to do these things. Cool. Let's go to Michael for a question. What do you got, Michael?
I was curious about the require. So you put require typically at the top, or that's where I've seen it.
Yeah.
Would you ever put require inside of a method and call that require kind of locally?
You could. Um, it's less typical to do that because typically if you want access to a class to do something like that, you would just do it at the top of the file. So like when we think about our project, for example, if I go over to my deck, well, let's go to my deck test file, for example. So in order to run my tests for my deck, I have to know what a card is because I have to build a whole bunch of cards before I can even test that my deck is being assembled properly. So in this case, right at the very top, I'm just requiring like all the things or many things in this case. Same with my turn spec, for example, at my very top up here, I'm requiring all of my other files because in order to have a turn, I have to have cards to make a deck, and the deck is assigned to a player because my turn needs 2 players, and each player needs a deck, and that deck needs a card. And so I just define all these things up at the very top. I could define this inside of here and say, okay, well, before I, do any of my setup, I could require my card in here. But this is a very sort of atypical thing. Like you typically wouldn't see this in Ruby. You would just define it up top because this is kind of like to other programmers, as soon as they open this file, they're going to see the very top of that file and go, oh, this is where we're like pulling in all these other class definitions. And so in Ruby, it's more typical to have all of the requires up at the very, very top like that.
Okay, thank you. One more question.
Yeah,
the adder readers, would you describe those as a scope modifier?
Ooh, scope modifier is a good question. So an adder reader, like we talked about in class the other day, it's effectively building a method where it's returning the instance variable of the same name. And so if I had type, for example, I've got type up here in my adder reader, we're effectively, adder reader is just kind of a shortcut that basically does this.
Right.
And so by doing an adder reader, it's really just, it's adding a method. So it's not really modifying the scope, but it's adding to the scope, certainly. Yes. And if we were to look at turn.methods, like if I make an instance of my turn class and I do turn.methods, I would actually see all of these showing up as methods because this is just shortcut for Ruby to say, hey, Ruby, go build a method called player1 that returns the instance variable called player1. Go make another method called player2 that returns the value of player2. So very similar to what I did here. Now we could customize this and do something else if we wanted to, but typically we wouldn't do this kind of thing. I mean, you can certainly build your own if you want to, but when we say, my turn dot type, it's going to say, okay, well, go find a method called type and go run that code. Well, in this case, if we have it as an adder reader, that code is just returning the instance variable or the value of that instance variable. So it's not really a scope modifier, but it is adding to the scope. The scope modifier would be like more like rearranging the context of things, like as far as like proper programming lingo. But again, that's not something that we would typically do in Ruby.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Let's go to Sammy for a question.
First of all, Michael, I really liked that question. It helped me out a lot. And kind of piggybacking onto that question, what about an adder accessor? Is that kind of a scope modifier? Maybe I'm not really understanding yet the rules of an adder accessor, but
okay. So
yeah.
we know that an adder reader. So if I had like an adder reader for name, then in my def initialize, it would look something like at name equals name because I'd be passing in a value of name here. And so an adder reader is effectively saying def name, and I'm going to return name. Now I'm putting the keyword return in here just to be explicit about it. But again, in Ruby, we don't have to. It's just our last line of code. But I just want to be super clear that when we make an adder reader, we're just reading the value out of this and we're returning that. An adder accessor, if we were to do an adder accessor for name, this is basically saying, well, I want to be able to possibly change that as well. But it also, I want to read it. And so what would happen here is we would actually pass in a potential value where it would be like nil by default, and then we would do something like if like unless name is nil, then we would set at name is equal to name, and then we return the name. And so if we pass in a value, then it's going to change it. And so this is how then we could say like dog equals dog.new, and we stop, and we would do something like dog.name equals Riker. So it's not exactly this way, but it allows us to do an assignment operator here. So it's not exactly like this, but just to give you a little bit of scope on what Accessor is doing, is it's saying I want to return the name if I just call dog.name, but if I want to assign it a value, it's effectively saying like if I'm passing, it would be similar to like if I was passing a value into a method called name. Now I want to like set that to something. So it's not exactly doing this, but it's along this line. I just wanted to kind of illustrate that a little bit. But we're getting a little off track here of the scope lesson. But again, it's not really a scope modifier. It's just adding things that are now available within our class. So it's not changing the scope as far as like, it's not like rearranging the order of things, but it's adding to it. So I guess in a sense, you could say it is modifying the scope in that we're adding something to it.
Okay, yeah. So I thought it was relating to scope because in my head it was like I'm accessing this variable from a different place and able to manipulate it where I wouldn't normally be able to.
Right.
So in my head, I thought it might have had something to do with scope, but that made sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And yeah, and one of the things that I mentioned in class the other day is you're not going to use adder accessors or adder writers very often. We want to be very careful about something outside of our class changing our value. Now, changing the dog's name, for example, we have rescued several dogs in the past where, we got the dog and the dog's name was like Ernie, and we're like, that's a dumb name for a dog. Your name is, Bob now instead, or something like that. And so in that case, yes, it would make sense to rename our dog. But most of the time we don't want something outside of our object changing the attributes in our object. The object itself should be in charge of that. And so you won't typically use accessors or writers very often. When we do an adder reader, this is a bit of an exception to the rule of how these things are available outside. So typically when we talked about how these things were set up before, we would say like, anything in our method is now available in our block, and anything in our class is now available in our method. Anything at a global scope is available like at any point, and so on, because we can always come inward. But when we make an adder reader like this, we're basically saying, okay, well, outside of our class, I now actually want to export this. And so we actually talk about this as being an export. Sorry for my handwriting. My handwriting is awful. That's why I like typing. But when we do an adder reader, we're basically saying, I want to export this. I want this to be available outside of my class. And so we're explicitly allowing something outside to see what we're doing. And so in that sort of way of thinking, it is a bit of a scope modifier, because we're saying like now instead of the scope only going inward, we're allowing the scope of that adder reader to let something outside of our class see the value of something. Because otherwise, for example, in here, I could have something like, age equals, 0 or something when the dog is born. And maybe I want to use age in other methods, but I don't necessarily want something outside of my object to know the age of the dog, which doesn't really make sense in the real world. But just as an example, we can define like instance variables inside of our class that we don't make an adder reader for. And so everything inside of our class can access this value and change that value and do something with that value, but we don't necessarily expose it outside. We don't necessarily export it outside. All right, let's go to one more question because I do want to give you time to do these exercises in groups. So let's go to Lee and then we'll move on from here.
This should be a quick question. When you wrote that method for the adder writer, what did the question mark accomplish in the unless portion of that code?
I'm trying to remember where I had that. Oh, the
You wrote the method for add a writer, and like you said, unless nil, and you put a question
yeah.
mark.
So unless like name.nil. So the question mark, anytime you see a question mark on a Ruby method, that's Ruby's way of saying, I expect that this is going to return just a true or false. So we're saying this is a kind of a Boolean response of, is this nil? Or if we have an array, for example, we can say like array.empty, and it's basically a true or false of whether there's anything in that array. And so anytime you see a question mark on the end of a method, that's our way of telling other developers like, hey, the question mark here means I'm only ever going to return a true or false, nothing else. And you can also do this yourself. So you can also like write, am I hungry? So I can say like, unless, I've eaten breakfast, I'm going to return true because I'm hungry. Otherwise, I'm going to return false because I've eaten breakfast and I'm no longer hungry. And so you can define your own methods with a question mark. But again, it's there to tell other developers using this code that I'm only returning a true or false. Again,
so it doesn't do anything to the actual code. It's just for human.
Not at all. No, it's just an indicator that it's going to return true or false. We're getting way off track here. All right. So I'm going to post that scope image in your chat because someone else was asking for that. So I will certainly put that in your channel. I'll drop that in your code help channel right now in the lesson plan, and I will drop that in Zoom chat. So in the Zoom chat right now, I'm pasting in the scope lesson for you. What I want you to do is I want you to spend the next 20 minutes working in breakout rooms. And I'm going to put you in with like 2 or 3 partners. What I want you to do is work through these exercises. So if you scroll down on the page a little bit, you'll see exploration part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. And there's a link on there like here's examples 1 through 5, here's examples 6 through 9, here's examples and so on. The idea is that you're not going to get through all of these in only 20 minutes, but I want you to get through as many of these as possible in 20 minutes. We're going to come back in 20 minutes and we're just going to kind of recap at the end. Okay, because I want to make sure that everybody's got a good understanding. So within your group, pick one person to like share their screen as a group. So I'll just pull up one of these really quickly here and I'll share my screen. So for examples 1 through 5, what I want you to do as a group is just take a look at this first block of code and just talk about it as a group. What do we think is going to happen if this code were to actually run? Discuss it, talk about why, talk about what error you think you're going to get. And then in your editor, actually go over to, in your editor, go build like a code.rb or a practice.rb. Actually put that code in there and go run that code and see what you got back. And then, as a team go, oh yeah, you were right. Or, oh yeah, I was completely off on what that error should be. These are meant to be very, very small samples and expected to get through some of these really, really quickly. And so what I want you to do is work through all of these as many of these exercises as you can in 20 minutes in your breakout rooms. And then we're going to come back in 20 minutes and kind of recap after that. So I will, while I've got you in your breakout rooms, I'll put that scope image in your code help channel. Are there any questions about what you're going to go do? Take that as a no. All right, so there are about 30 of us in here. So I'm going to make, let's see, can I get, yeah, so we'll do 3 to 4 people per room. So I'm going to make 10 breakout rooms and I'm going to give you all 20 minutes to work in there. And then we'll come back after that. All right, here come your rooms. We'll see you in a little bit. What's up, Megan?
Hello.
All right, welcome back. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully that was helpful. Again, you don't have to finish all of those exercises, but I do encourage you, like, try to find some time to go through them. There's also an exercise at the very bottom of the lesson as well, if you want to continue to practice on these and learn a little bit more about the scopes and so on. What I want to do for the last little bit of the class is actually just recap some notes, and then I'll paste these notes into your channel for you as well, just so you got like high level understanding of some of the stuff. So just as a recap, we'll go over here. So when we talk about scope, we're basically saying Ruby is interpreting things from top to bottom. And so if we, as we look at this screenshot, for example, we kind of see like we're always working like top to bottom, left to right, kind of thing. And Ruby is either learning code, like a definition of a class or a method or a variable, or it's executing code. When we talk about the scope of variables, variables can be accessed within our current scope or deeper. So again, that's coming to the idea of, from within our method, we can access any variables from our method inside of the block, but we can't go back outside typically. The only time that we could really go outside would be, as a class, for example, if we do an add a reader, we're going to export that to the outside world. Or within a method, for example, we could like send back a return value or take in a parameter or something like that. That would be the only way really to have scope of that outside of our method. Otherwise, variables, they're accessible in whatever block that we define. So actually, let's keep this back up here. So if we define a variable in a method, it's available anywhere inside that container or anything deeper inside like that block. A variable defined inside a block can only be used inside the block, but again, can't be used outside of the block. And we looked at that a little bit when we were looking at accumulators and so on the other day. Within a method, Ruby can call methods that it's already learned, so they don't necessarily have to be defined in order. So as an example, I could define, method A, and I could define method B, and I could have method A call method B if I wanted to, and method B could just puts like hello. And then down here, I could do something like call method A. And if I go run that code, we see that it prints hello down here. And so because Ruby's interpreting this top to bottom, it's not actually executing the code until we actually call the method, and then it actually executes. And so the first thing Ruby's doing is it's going top to bottom, is it's learning like, oh, this is where I've defined method A, this is where I've defined method B. Now you want me to go call method A. So now I'm actually going to execute the code inside of that. And when it sees method B, it goes, oh yeah, I already know where that is. And it can go call that method. And so because it's interpreting it and learning top to bottom, then we can call them in any order. So some programming languages, for example, it would complain here and say, well, I can't call method B because you haven't defined it yet. And so we would have to literally rearrange this and put this up above, but Ruby doesn't care about that. Ruby doesn't care about the order. As long as it's learned where those things exist, that's all Ruby needs. So Ruby can go call any method that it's already learned. Methods can't share variables. So again, kind of coming back to this block diagram, any variable that we define inside this method is only scoped within this method. We can't really send anything outside of that method. We could pass them as parameters or send something back as a return value, but a variable that we define inside this method is not going to be available inside of this method. The difference or the exception there would be something like an instance variable within our class, because an instance variable defined in a class is available everywhere in that class. When it comes to a class, it's usually the only thing in a file by itself, and there's generally no executable code inside of that. And so when we talk about defining a class, this would be in like deck.rb or card.rb, and it's the only thing in that file. There's generally no executable code plus the definition of the class. That file is just going to be the class definition itself. Instance variables can be declared anywhere inside this class. So whether it's inside your init method that we have up here, or if you define like an at inside this method, it'll be available inside this method. If we define it inside this method, it'll be available inside this method. So we can define those instance variables anywhere, and we can use them anywhere within the scope of the whole class because it's an instance variable. One key thing that I want to mention here, if you try to use an instance variable before you actually initialize it to something, Ruby is going to initialize it as a nil value. This may kind of jump up and catch you by surprise. If you try to use an instance variable that you're expecting to be like a value of 5, for example, it may fail. And so just know that if you try to use an instance variable before you've actually set its value, it'll typically be set to nil by default. When we talk about global scope, this would typically be like a runner file, as we've defined previously, and there's only one global scope for the whole application. Also, when we talk about global scope, if I define like a equals 5, I can't use, like I can't say, you know, puts a inside of here, because it's not going to know what a is. If I try and run this code, I get undefined local variable or method a, because it can't see the variable outside. Even though this is technically kind of a global scope, the idea of global scope is a little bit trickier in Ruby. There are ways of saying, I want to define this as a global variable that's accessible anywhere in my code, that I can read or write anywhere in my code. In most programming languages, though, you'll have a lot of developers highly discourage the use of global variables. But just for the sake of theory, I'm going to show you how to do it in Ruby. You just put a $sign in front of it. And a $sign says, I really want this to be globally scoped. But this is really unusual in Ruby. You generally would not see this happening in Ruby. But just for the sake of theory, just wanted to show you this is a possibility for a globally scoped variable. You just put a $sign in front of it. But we don't want you using it in Mod1. You generally will not, very rarely, you will ever need to use a global variable in Ruby. Because Ruby is an object-oriented programming language, we would typically be defining variables inside of our classes or inside of our methods, and we want to restrict the scope of these things. And we'll learn about that a little bit more as we get into abstraction and encapsulation. But if you absolutely know that you need to have a global variable, you can put a $sign in front of it, but we don't want you using it in Mod1. Let's go to Jacob for a quick question there.
So this might have gone completely over my head, but for the runner files, so if I were to make another Ruby file and then I would do require, you know, like .lib code.rb for that file, does the code.rb, would I call that a runner file in that case?
The file that requires that other file would be your runner, yeah. And so that's the one where you typically, like for example, if my code.rb was like actually running my you know, my war or peace game, right? I'd be requiring in my deck, and I'd be requiring in my cards, and I'd be requiring in my players, my turns, and so on. And I'd actually be doing something with all of that.
Oh, so in this case, the code.rb is the runner file because it's requiring other.
It's requiring
Ruby
in
files.
everything else. And then it's actually like using all of that other code. And so now my code.rb is my runner. And this is kind of the start of the global scope of like what's available and so on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. So I'll get these notes pushed over to your code help channel, but let's take a couple other questions before we wrap up. Let's go to Marla next.
Okay, so you might have kind of said this, but I feel like I'm still confused about it. So variables outside of the method, unless they're within a class, the method can't access it. It's not, I guess the variable just being declared in the document doesn't put it outside of the scope of a method.
It is one of the exceptions to what I explained earlier, where we said, like, if I define a variable inside a method, it's available inside a block. If I define an instance variable inside my class, it's available in my method and my block. And if we define something at a global level, it's available at all of these. Like, we can always go in deeper. The exception though, is here at the global scope. If I say like a equals 5, I can't access a inside of here. It doesn't know what it is. That's where we have to do like $a instead. But again, we don't really want you to get into the global scope of global variables.
But you can access it. You can't access it in the method. Could you access it in a class? Like, is there?
Sorry, repeat the last part again.
If there's a variable that's outside of everything, it's just not going to be accessed anywhere else.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, no problem. No, these are great questions, and I'm happy to clear this stuff up. All right, let's go to Michael for one last question.
If you call a method inside of another method, are the variables of the called method available to the method you are calling the other one from? Does that make sense?
So if I understand right, if I say like b equals 5 in this method, can I access b inside of here? If this calls this other method?
Yes.
The answer is no. What we could do here is if I really needed the value of b, I would like return, sorry for the yellow on here, let's get a darker color. If I return b as a value, then when I call that other method, I can say like b equals like method, and then it'll return that value of b from there, and then I would have access to it, but I'd have to explicitly return it from here in order to have access to it in here. So no, local variables that you define here, like d equals 5, d is not available inside that other method, even if you call the other method, because that variable only exists inside this block. It doesn't, it can't go outside of that block unless we return it. Or if I really want to call like method, like I want to call this method, but I want to pass data into that method, that's where we would pass it as a parameter. And I would say like, pass in my value of b as a parameter here. So now this would have a copy of that data. That would be like an exception there.
Thank you.
All right, cool. Last question from Catherine, then we got to wrap up.
So I just remember like something that I got stuck on from last module. And I don't know if this is covered in like classes after this, but so like if you have two different classes and you have methods in each one of them and you're requiring in the class file into the other class file, and like you have like dog.run, and then you have like, or trying to think, something that I'm trying to think of another file that it could be under, but like how I didn't understand back then how you could pull in like @dog.run into a new method in the other class.
Right. So again, it comes down to what Ruby has learned about. So inside my card, for example, I've defined my card, but inside my deck, I kind of need to know what cards are, but in this case, I don't actually, like I'm not building a card inside my deck, but I'm being given an array of cards. And so this comes down to what we call single responsibility, where like this class is only responsible to do one thing. We're going to cover that more in another class. Okay. And so, inside of here, I can look at card.rank without knowing like what a card actually is. I can just sort of assume that card.rank is a thing from this other class. I have a rank available to me. So I can read that value inside another class because I'm being passed an object of that type. Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit more as we get into more classes or more like instructional classes about what's available as we pass these objects around as parameters and so on.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we got to wrap up here. You've all got a class with Megan on enumerables, so check for a calendar link for that. And or Megan,
I was just going to say, let's go ahead and start the next lesson at 10:10. And the Zoom link is in the calendar. I will also drop it in the enumerables thread that I started in the 2105 code help channel.
Cool.
So I'll see y'all at 10:10.
All right. Thanks, Megan. And thanks everybody for the great questions. Drop those notes in your code help channel. Definitely reach out to us if there's any misunderstandings or confusion. I really do encourage you, like, try to finish up those exercises on your own. Try to find some time to do that. It's going to really help you understand this. The idea with scope is we could just like throw tons of words at you, but until you actually experience it yourself, it's a little harder to grasp. And so we really do want you to work through those exercises just so you see those errors and read those errors and really understand what's going on. Cool. All right. We'll see you next time.